Annual Venture Summit. I feel like Charlie Rose or Oprah, I'm not sure which, but I'm going to jump right into the topic at hand because we have two incredible speakers to start off what I think is an incredible day. Today's topic, of course, is innovation, a new day in the United States. I am really particularly thrilled to moderate this session as UVA's first executive director of UVA Innovation. Recognizing many of the economic forces, societal trends, and innovation partnership opportunities that our speakers, both in this session and throughout the day, will discuss, UVA and the Office of the Vice President for Research, led by Tom Skalak, created this somewhat unique platform position about 2 years ago for a Chief Innovation Officer. And I'm delighted to tell you that it's getting lots of resonance, lots of attention, lots of research being done on what we're doing and how it's going as we've sought to broaden the innovation landscape and innovation role at UVA. 2 years into the evolution of this initiative, we've accomplished much to re-engineer our processes and policies around innovation, to reach across grounds and throughout Virginia, the nation, and the world, to say that UVA is open for business and open for innovation partnerships, to expand our research focus from lab to market in order to create more market and investor-ready innovation opportunities, and to connect with students, both undergraduate and graduate, with faculty, with staff, with the community, with our alums, and with other stakeholders, to infuse innovation and entrepreneurship throughout the research, teaching, business practices, and engagement activities of the university. And if you don't believe, that's more than words. If you haven't heard, you should know, for example, that just in the last month, a UVA student team won the highly competitive and prestigious Business Concept Plan competition at South by Southwest. And just this week, we heard that another UVA team won a national business plan competition sponsored by the Walmart Corporation for Sustainable Enterprise. So lots of buzz going on at Mr. Jefferson's University. When I interviewed for this job 2 years ago, I actually made a bit of a joke, potentially a dangerous one, at my first meeting with the search committee, when 90 minutes into the interview, someone asked a question about Mr. Jefferson's views on this or that. And as a native North Carolinian, I said, I wanted to note that this was the longest I'd ever been with people from UVA without mentioning Mr. Jefferson. So I've got to give my own Mr. Jefferson quote that I think is relevant to today. Mr. Jefferson said that wherever an invention proves to be useful, it ought to be tried. So what we're trying to do is to create the infrastructure, the networks, the relationships to ensure that we are leading the way among U.S. institutions of higher education and our ability to deliver on Mr. Jefferson's belief. So enough from me. Let's get into the meat of the panel. I want to introduce our two panelists up front, that I'm going to ask them to make opening statements, and then we'll get into the Q&A session, both with questions I have prepared, but hopefully with questions that you in the audience would like to pose yourselves. To my right is Stephan Dolezalek, a partner with Vantage Point in Silicon Valley, where he leads the Clean Tech Group. He has headed Vantage Point's software and life sciences groups as well. Stephan is a double who, I've learned that term as well, with degrees in architecture and law. He sits on many boards as a prolific speaker and writer on the subject of innovation and venture markets. And those of you who were here last year will recall that he led an outstanding thought leader discussion on the sustainability of sustainability as a venture capital opportunity. I also like to find out something about speakers that they don't necessarily tell you in their bios, and I learned searching the web on Mr. Dolezalek that he's quite an outstanding photographer. He has some great stuff on the web if you want to take a look. To my left is Aneesh Chopra, who has just completed 3.5 or so years as the nation's first Chief Technology Officer and Associate Director for Technology in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Aneesh worked tirelessly in that role to advance the administration's technology and innovation agenda by encouraging government-wide coordination to help the country meet its goals of more jobs, reducing healthcare costs, protecting the environment, national security, and otherwise. Previously, Aneesh served as Virginia's 4th Secretary of Technology. Prior to his work in the state and federal governments, Aneesh was the managing director of a publicly traded healthcare think tank. The publication Government Technology called him one of the nation's top 25 doers, dreamers, and drivers. I found that. I also found that Jon Stewart called him the Indian George Clooney.
Anyway, moving on. Nothing to see here.
All right, so with these two great speakers, I'm going to finish with my introductory remarks, invite Stephan to go to the podium and make his initial presentation.
Clooney's going to be a hard act to follow.
Okay, easy.
So listen, I'm going to run through a whole bunch of slides very, very quickly. The idea is really to kick off some of the thinking for the day. And I really want to begin with something that is the culmination of 3 terrific sessions that the Darden School sponsored and ultimately came up with this Declaration of Innovation. And I want to start here because I think the key thought points around education, entrepreneurial culture, investment, immigration, taxation, governance, and property rights is really what this is all about. And I'll come back to this at the end because when we switch over to Senator Warner, his notion of the Startup Act follows directly on a lot of these principles. So one of the things we've struggled with in terms of innovation is why is it so hard? And I'm always struck by the fact that we see a lot of things out ahead of us that seem pretty obvious. But that's because we live in this innovation world. If you go back and look at history, you've got some really interesting comments. You know, the notion that the telephone has too many shortcomings to be seriously considered as a means of communication. The device is inherently of no value to us. That's an internal memo from Western Union. The horse is here to stay, but the automobile is only a novelty, a fad. That's Henry Ford's lawyer being told not to invest in Ford Motor Company. While theoretically and technically television may be feasible, commercially and financially, it's an impossibility, a development of which we need waste little time dreaming. That's the inventor of the vacuum tube and one of the radio pioneers. And lastly, transmission of documents via telephone wires is possible in principle, but the apparatus required is so expensive that it will never become a practical proposition. So, and one last one. From the FCC commissioner in 1965, there's practically no chance communication space satellites will be used to provide better telephone, telegraph, television, or radio service inside the United States. This is what we deal with. You know, in my world, I'm constantly told solar will never be cheap enough. Electric vehicles will never be cheap enough. But they're statements just like this. They're conventional wisdom. And innovation is all about challenging the conventional wisdom. The other piece that I think we also have to pay a lot of attention to is the difference between what I call building our social infrastructure and building our social well-being. You know, there's a lot of things in innovation that are really hard, that take a long time, and those tend to be on the left side of this page. Once we've built them, then we can focus on the societal well-being parts. But the right side of the page can't exist without the left, and we often forget that relationship. Why is that relationship becoming ever more important? Because there's a series of curves, and in fact, one of the things that I think we'll see throughout the day is these exponential growth curves. You know, you don't see them coming, and then suddenly they're on top of you in a very, very big way. And the reality is, there's a lot more of us on this planet. We're living longer, thanks to medicine and biotechnology. Unfortunately, we consume a lot more energy. In fact, we consume a lot more of everything. And we're at a point where the reality is that the world cannot, in fact, live at the lifestyle that we in the West have developed. And there's a lot of statistics about how many different places, whether it's food prices, fertilizer, iron ores. I love the chart on the left side of the page that shows the percentage of the world's consumption that China now represents, starting with over half of the cement, almost half of the iron ore, almost half of the coal, and rising. So this is a reality that we have to face in terms of what innovation needs to do. The good news is, it seems like innovation keeps happening faster and faster. So it's something that we've gotten used to. it's something that clearly is accelerating. The not so good half, if you're in business, is that the pace of creative destruction is also accelerating. This shows how long on average a company can expect to stay in the Fortune 500. So think about it. The biggest companies in the country can only stay around for about 10 years in the Fortune 500. That's how rapid the pace of change even there is. And obviously this is a big driver of a lot of the political and policy movements we see, is an attempt to actually resist this pace of change. In a more real world, in a university environment, look at what's happened in music. Basically, every 5 years, you've got to entirely change the format wars. Not a happy place to be if you're trying to rely upon long-term stasis of a business model. In some ways, more interesting is this one, which says, yes, there's constant change, but what's really changed in a very, very massive way is that what people actually wanted to buy was singles, not full LPs. And so while music sales for LPs, cassettes, CDs, etc. are down, what's up massively is sales of individual songs. The other thing that's happened is we get these waves that come at us in multiplicities. So if you think about what happened with Kodak that just recently declared bankruptcy, Kodak knew digital cameras were coming. Kodak, in fact, invented a lot of the original digital camera patents. What it didn't see coming was the camera phone and the video in the camera phone. And so if you look at the history of Kodak, it invented digital film or digital cameras back in 1975. It actually decided consciously not to pursue that, and for literally 20 years, looks like it was the right decision because the stock continued to go up. Unfortunately, at some point, digital actually did take hold, and from there, it's been a very, very rapid path downhill. The other part is that it often takes a long, long time for a superstar to emerge. One of my favorite quotes going back to 1997, and this is a long time after Apple was founded, but a recent, fairly short period after Dell was formed. And Michael Dell was speaking at one of the innovation conferences and said, if I ran Apple, I would shut it down and give the money back to the shareholders. At that point in time, Dell, being the rapidly rising red curve here, looked like a smart answer. Unfortunately, history shows otherwise. So, yes, today Apple is an unbelievable growth phenomenon, but look at how long it took at the bottom of that curve. Right? So this is another one of these exponential growth curves. Another thing I think we'll hear more and more about, and this is a study from the Kauffman Foundation that really looked at where do new jobs in this country come from. And the most important point, we've had for a long time, we've had people talk about small businesses where jobs come from. And in fact, their findings showed that jobs come from new businesses and they come from rapidly growing businesses. So if you want more jobs, you actually have to create lots of new companies and you have to find ways to help them grow very, very rapidly. Critical finding. And coming out of all this, we've now invented all these laws of innovation. I actually find the one from Gordon Moore, which is his own scribblings, in some ways to be the best, simply because it shows that before you can go up and to the right, you in effect have to go down. But we've now got it even for Facebook. The law of sharing, Metcalfe's law of networks is very similar. We've got it in solid state lighting. We've obviously got it in almost all of IT, and you can either plot it on a logarithmic curve and make it a straight line, but otherwise, once again, it's this exponential growth curve. But we've got some issues. We've invented all these wonderful things, but look at where they get built today. Whether it's personal computers, cell phones, televisions, semiconductors, digital cameras, wind power, solar power, nuclear power, most of it is manufactured somewhere else in the world today. And when we look at some of the new technologies that we're working on, the hard stuff today, look at what happened with wind. If you look at wind from the left side of that curve from 1982 through 1992, the proportion of new installations in the U.S. clearly led. But what then happened, and if you look at the top right-hand graph, those two little black dots represent the years in which we didn't have a PTC. There were no tax credits for wind. All of a sudden, we stopped installing wind in the United States. And when you look at the bottom chart, the net result of that is that the U.S. represents the red in terms of where we are in cumulative capacity. The blue represents the rest of the world. So when we stuttered from a tax policy standpoint, the rest of the world took over. If you look at solar, as I said, I've heard for 10 years now solar will never be cheap enough. And we've followed a pretty steady logarithmic curve. But literally in the last 24 months, prices have just dropped through the floor. We've gone from $2 a watt to 75 cents a watt, and the consensus at the World Economic Forum this spring was that we'd be down at 50 cents a watt. Why have we gotten so cheap so quickly? Because of competition, because of scaling of manufacturing. But look at where it's scaled. Bottom bar on the right is the US. China and the rest of the world have taken over manufacturing solar. So we benefit from lower prices, but those jobs are going elsewhere. So I want to go back to this notion of fundamental innovation versus social innovation. There's a lot of things that are making tremendous amounts of money in terms of the internet, in terms of social networking. But you have to realize that none of those could exist if we hadn't done the hard stuff first. Without the computer, without the internet, without the cell phone, we couldn't have had internet commerce. So you always have to invent the fundamentals before you can get to the applications. And what it leads to is this really where we want to go in terms of the model for success? At a corporate level, we've got an over-focus on quarterly earnings. This, I guess, is the internet world of quarterly earnings. If you can start a company and ultimately get to selling it for $1 billion at a value of $77 million per employee, it's pretty good. Unfortunately, what it also says is there weren't a whole lot of employees in this company. And so if we're looking for job growth, we may have to grow different kinds of companies. I think this is our fundamental challenge. We start as a pioneering country, and the question is, can we get back to it? And what will it take to get back to it? These are some of the things that in my fund we're doing. It's the Tesla car, it's windmills, it's very large-scale solar power. But it takes us back to where I started, which is these are the tools we have, and the real challenge is how do we use education, entrepreneurialism, investment, immigration policy, taxation, governance, and intellectual property rights to help us build the economy that we want in this country. Thank you.
Aneesh?
Well, thank you very much. I will just riff off of the comments that you just heard. This is exactly the agenda of innovation that the President had spoken of when he unveiled his strategy for American innovation back in September of 2009. It is, by the way, just as a parenthetical note, I wanted to say a shout out. Jim Duffy, my successor as Secretary of Technology, is in the House. So I wanted to just a little shout out to Jim. And it's an important point because as we transition administrations, even parties, the topic of innovation tends to be bipartisan. In fact, the Jobs Act that Senator Warner will speak of was carried in the House by Republican Congressman Eric Cantor on ideas that the President introduced in his Jobs Act back in September. So what I'm about to share with you is reflective, I think, of about a broader consensus in the political environment that reaches across the aisle. I think the key point I wanted to share with you is about how policymakers think about this challenge. There's a fundamental debate around the world between top-down and bottom-up models of innovation. And I think President Obama, maybe not in the news as clear, but has very much embraced the spirit of bottom-up innovation. And this strategy document he unveiled emphasizes where we felt the role of government might be most helpful. And we identified three key areas, at least that guided our work. The first was where we invested should be in the building blocks of innovation. Now, traditionally, we think of this as roadways, railways, and runways. But increasingly, that involves three other forms of infrastructure. One is human capital. And you see that right up the front with both education and immigration. And the president spoke very loudly and clearly that we as a country have to return our leadership in not only the proportion of our population with college degrees, getting back to number one by 2020, but also emphasizing science, technology, engineering, and mathematics with 100,000 STEM graduates over the same time. The second addition, if you will, to the infrastructure debate is research and development. So the notion of making it here, inventing it here, that is critical. And if you look at what our corporate research labs have done, they've shrunk. I'm a IT guy in telecommunications. You can't get a better sort of example of this than Bell Labs. Anybody that used to engage in telecommunications innovation would sort of celebrate and say, yeah, we'd all convene at Bell Labs. All the best and the brightest in academia, private sector would all go up there, and 35,000 engineers, and they'd think of the future. And anybody that wants to visit now, it's a shadow of its former self. And so you ask, where's the leadership in R&D on telecommunications? And there isn't exactly an NIH equivalent, so another one of those challenges. So that's the second addition on the notion of what a building block of innovation is. But the third one, maybe it may be too flip. I happen to, again, bias on the IT side. I do believe we're entering a third era of economic growth on the internet. And the importance of mobile broadband and wireless innovation in general, I think will create, estimates are, about $100 billion of economic value over the next decade. And in addition to the Startup Act, the Jobs Act that the president signed into law, the National Wireless Initiative is also one of those infrastructure investments that's now law. In a funny quirk of society, this didn't actually cost the taxpayers anything, actually saved taxpayers money. We basically created a market mechanism so broadcasters could voluntarily auction excess capacity so that mobile operators, or anyone frankly, could purchase those rights and then commercialize them with mobile broadband service. That, we believe, will generate $20+ billion to take down to the Treasury, partly to pay down the deficit and also to help our first responders have the infrastructure they need to succeed. So infrastructure in a new way was where we felt the government should invest. The second question was rules of the road. If you took a look at the policies that we have in place, and you can cut across a number of them, policies that affect our capital markets, policies that affect our immigration, a range of industry-specific policies that have stifled creativity. We emphasized a number of key policies, some that are now law and some that we're struggling with. You saw in the energy debate, I would debate an area where we've struggled to get consensus in the country as to how to move forward. But in the areas where we've been successful, you'll hear from Senator Warner on the Jobs Act. The one message I want to say to everybody in this room is the following. I personally believe the crowdfunding provisions of the law and the general disclosure freedoms will mean that startups conceived of in Scalac's brain or a screening mechanism in the ecosystem more generally here can raise the capital they need. Can you imagine a UVA alumni crowdfunding platform that heard all about the great work that the various commercialization activities that Mark is going to bring forward can now invest, if they make under $100,000 a year, up to 5% of their income, and if they make more, they can invest more. You don't have to have just the accredited investors take a share of the pie. This could dramatically shift not only where capital flows, but to what sectors of the economy. You're going to see neighborhood Starbucks competitors emerge where customers will finance through crowdfunding the local shop that might have a better flavor. So the second element of rules of the road, crowdfunding, but beyond crowdfunding, the other two provisions, even if we haven't gotten immigration done in terms of a new law, we have taken a hard look at the existing authorities. And I'll just give you but one example. We found out that one can be an H-1B employee and founder of a company. So this idea of a startup visa, which is not legally yet in place, we've got a poor man's version of it by saying here are the methods by which an immigrant entrepreneur, and by the way, the number of them at universities that have come up to me, many of them happen to be of Indian descent, and when I go out to campuses, they come up to me afterwards, some of them crying, hey, I've now given this thing a shot. We went live with this clarifying rule on H-1B back in August, and it's been just 7-8 months, and people are literally getting their visas now approved. And it's good for the economy, good for the country, but it's just a baby step. But more importantly are the sectors of the economy that have not seen productivity growth. McKinsey had done this phenomenal study that job growth and productivity growth are actually linked. One would have presumed a more productive sector loses jobs. But what they found is it becomes a leaner sector and it can promote innovation, bring new ideas to market. So what we found out is the sectors of the American economy that have had very limited productivity growth, healthcare, energy, and dare I say education itself, we've now put in place policies, perhaps in Q&A we'll get into some of the detail, but the one I'll be more specific about is the Affordable Care Act will do more to spur breakthroughs in innovation in healthcare than any other policy measure we could have introduced, whether it be subsidizing R&D in NIH or anything else. Why? Because the payment system in healthcare is what stifled the ability to bring to market some of the breakthrough ideas, remote monitoring and wireless sensors and patient communications techniques and data mining, none of which is reimbursable today. Under the Affordable Care Act, if the Innovation Center in Medicare issues a pilot project that changes the way doctors and hospitals get paid, and they deem that that payment change has led to improvements in quality and reduced cost, not based on political advice, but based on the actuary of HHS, we have the authority to change the way folks get paid. We now have a clear path to take breakthroughs to market by changing payment, and that I think is going to unbelievably revolutionize the healthcare sector. Finally, the third leg of the stool for the president's innovation strategy is for government to be leaner, meaner, better, or as I was alluding to earlier since we're in Jefferson's home, a wiser and more frugal government, as he called for in his inaugural address. We have set goals to slash lab-to-market bureaucracy by 50%. Secretary Chu launched the America's Next Top Energy Innovator, where you could literally get an option on a license for $1,000 in any federal lab, and just blanketly made that available. NIH is now following suit. We've established business.usa.gov, which has opened up all this data about where and how we have friction in engaging with the government, so you can be dramatically more efficient. We've cleared up and cleaned up a number of our procedures in the NSF so that now every single quarter, any NSF-funded research can ask for a $50,000 spot award to take their idea and commercialize it. They're not waiting for some 10-year vision. They've got an idea, they submit it, and they get an answer in 45 days. And by the way, we've had 2 rounds of solicitation, and the only 2 Virginians that have won are right here at UVA. So congratulations to you, and again, thanks to Tom's great leadership. So this philosophy of opening up data, of expanding where government can be an enabler and can foster, reducing friction, but can foster the kind of translation of work from our federal labs and our federally funded research across our nation's universities. This movement is starting. The president issued an executive order directing this be done better and is calling our agency heads to account to show results. That's, I think, the response to the private sector vision that you alluded, how a public sector could interface. And for that, perhaps we can dive into where you want to go.
Terrific. Well, first of all, okay, we have about 20 minutes for Q&A with these 2 outstanding folks. I have several on my list, but I would invite you to go to the microphones at any time, because I'd rather have the audience posing the questions, because that way you might ask them one they haven't anticipated. They've actually anticipated a few of the ones I'm going to ask. So please don't be shy. Go to the microphones at the front of each of the aisles and let us know when you're ready to start asking questions. I'd like to get it started by maybe asking Stephan to consider the following. I heard both speakers, but particularly Stephan, allude to infrastructure innovations versus application innovations. The former including things like computer, telephones, televisions, planes, trains, cars, etc. The latter including software, internet, Skype, movies, and so forth. Obviously, you can't have the latter without the former. I guess I'd like to have first Stephan and Aneesh, if you'd like as well, comment on whether you think universities are focusing on the right mix. Are research universities focusing on the right mix in terms of these 2 types of innovations in order to feed the economy and some of the benefits that we've heard you allude to?
I think the universities are. I think the real question is, are students going into the areas of study at universities that they need to go into to actually foster the left side of the page? And clearly, with some of the immigration policies, with some of the visa policies, I think as we focus on science, technology, engineering, and medicine, those are the critical fields, because those are the fields that drive the left-hand side of the page. But I think ultimately, and it goes back to your Bell Labs example, we've got to celebrate the notion that somebody as an engineer and as a scientist working in a lab, as opposed to working for Facebook, can actually be seen as highly successful, highly valuable in our society. It goes back to my comment about short-term versus long-term rewards. And I think the danger we have today is that students a lot of times come to universities, and the model that they know best, that is right out in front of them, is the short-term model. It's the right-hand side of the page.
Very interesting.
One brief comment. We recently engaged in the discussion of big data, which I assume is a raging and hot topic across campuses throughout the country. And we tackled this question head on, Mark, because when universities respond to the investors that fund them, and obviously our research labs and our federal agencies are a big source of funding. So we actually struck this balance. In the big data solicitation that was coordinated across the federal agencies, there was a thoughtful blend between tools you can use that you would consider to be big data infrastructure, new ways to actually think about hardware and software to analyze and process large volumes of data, and applications that could be deployed in health and energy, manufacturing, and the like. And I think in the big data solicitation, you would likely see kind of an internal debate amongst the government agencies, where is that balance? And so maybe that could be a model for how the other funding programs move forward, so that you don't overinvest in some and under in the other. In general, I would argue that universities do a good job focusing on the infrastructure side, in part because that's where a lot of the core research and development activity comes in. My anxiety on infrastructure is really, it's more the question of seams. So there might be digital infrastructure where we think about computing capacity, and then there might be health infrastructure, modernizing the way we treat patients, and the intersection of the two may be underfunded. So you might have two very robust sectors where infrastructure and core R&D is a key element, but really the value is created when you combine those two, and then applications that flourish on top. So I'm mostly concerned about seam funding between bio, info, and nano than anything else when it comes to university research.
Actually, if I can riff on the big data comment for a minute, what's interesting to me is big data to some extent is what I would call the incumbent's definition.
Okay.
Because if you think about the innovator's definition, a lot of where the innovation is going on is much more what we'd call Internet of Things.
Yes.
And in an Internet of Things world, part of what we're doing is moving the computing power out to the edge, very much as we did with cell phones. But if you now think of it literally at the micro level, where the computing is done in a heart rate monitor, it's done in a temperature monitor, it's done in sensors in the room. Mm-hmm. The calculation is done. All of a sudden, you don't have big data flowing. But that whole notion of saying, what if we took everything we've done in social networking and internet between people, and we now have that happen between machines and equipment in the background, that becomes a huge part of this. And so your seams notion, I think, is a very important one in terms of there are things that when we start combining these worlds, we get very, very interesting outcomes.
Yep. Audience, don't be shy. While we're waiting for the first brave soul to approach the microphone, I think another way to look at the question that was just addressed is maybe looking at this sort of short-term versus long-term gratification issue. I guess from my point of view, I would say that it seems that our economic system and structure is geared more toward looking for success in 5 years or less. And clearly infrastructure investments of the type you've heard discussed take ever so much longer. Aneesh, what can or is the government doing, or funding agencies doing, or what can financial institutions and investment organizations do to help spur more sustainable infrastructure innovation?
So this was probably the most controversial debate in where we are as a country right now, because there's naturally a role for government investment in infrastructure, and for some of the capital-intensive energy investments, there's a question mark about long-term, short-term, and the role of government. I think that's a policy debate that people with values have to allocate to say whether or not this deserves more or less funding in the context of the overall pie, and you're going to have different opinions. Our administration erred on the side of more government investment in infrastructure, and others might have a different view. But I will make one kind of broader point, which is irrespective of capital spend, the one area that there is universal agreement on but room for improvement in is the permitting and infrastructure bureaucracy. And I'll just make the example of solar. He is absolutely right. Solar has fallen like a rock. By the way, that's the reason Solyndra went down. I mean, their competitors just basically undercut the prices. And under normal circumstances, by the way, in a regular kind of American response, people would have been more angry about the competitors overseas that were basically flooding the market with underpriced goods and saying an American firm is being attacked by this. But that's not how these political things play out. But I will say this. On solar, there is a $1 billion hidden tax on every residential solar installation in America. And you don't know what it is. It's the equivalent of waiting for the cable guy. A solar permitting process throughout, and Charlottesville's got a process. Every little jurisdiction in America has their own process for processing a solar permit application for residential rooftops. In some cities, it is literally a day. In others, it could be 7-8 months. So we put a race to the rooftop challenge through the Department of Energy to shine a light on this embarrassing problem to see if we can cut by 60 to 70% the average time to get solar permits processed. There should not be controversial political views about that. We have a guest here.
Yes, Dick.
I actually want to follow up on and ask a question to both panelists that reflects your conversation already. This whole topic of innovation, first you both agreed it's essentially a bipartisan as the Jobs Act. Everyone agrees we need to have more innovation to improve the economy. Second, it's a complex subject, as is evidenced simply by your last example, for instance, of solar permitting. It's multifaceted. How do we do it? And given those two, we're about to go into a presidential election, which will be, by all accounts, the most expensive in history, largest use of television, 30-second sound bites, of which we're already seeing them here in Virginia, which totally distort the debate. And my question to you is, we have a session like this, which is very informative. You've got people, but how do we get out to the average American and really explain these issues and not get lost? I mean, you mentioned Solyndra, you mentioned the Affordable Care Act. Just using those two, we don't see the issue of Solyndra as being a good thing, in a sense that it's creative destruction because the cost of solar panels is going down. It gets turned around on its head. Affordable Care Act, obviously, and we're about to have, I mean, all the things that are in it to improve healthcare innovation and efficiency are lost in the debate on the insurance mandate. So my question is, how can we do a better job of informing the American public, and so we have wiser decisions? The problem is, if they don't understand and they translate that lack of understanding in their decision making at the polls, we won't have the national policies that you all are espousing, and I think that we need. So, do you want to comment?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think the Supreme Court has helped us in terms of decisions about who can spend how much, because obviously incumbency has the money to spend, and I think that's one of our issues. I think the other one is literally an understanding of where we came from. My slide on pioneering. This is a country based upon equal opportunity. And I think we've somehow forgotten that equal opportunity means the opportunity to succeed and the opportunity to fail. And I think we've tried to sort of get rid of the opportunity to fail part and assure that we only get the success part. And I think we've got to go back to the notion that says failure is an inherent part of who we are. falling down, getting back up, and succeeding is what made this country great. And rather than stigmatizing failure, we've got to turn it around, and we've got to get to a point where we recognize that the more times we fail, the more times we try, ultimately we will be embracing change. And as long as we embrace that change, I've got no concern that we have the capabilities to be highly successful.
I want to make one just sort of hopeful comment about this. I spent the past 3 years in Washington. I saw two cities. I lived in two cities. There was the city of thoughtful, deliberative, the republic that we were taught in high school, where people on both sides of the aisle, even if they had different views, rolled up their sleeves and got to work in a substantive and thoughtful way. And I'll talk about that momentarily. And then there's the embarrassing, silly, no data-driven, a stain on the country, makes you want to vomit, kind of marketing and PR thing, which just sickens everyone to their stomachs because you feel like, how does the best country on the planet do this to itself? I just want to give you hope that there's actually both, and that underneath the mess, substance happens. And I just want to share with you just a couple of examples at the federal and the state level. The president's jobs and innovation activities, the bill he submitted in September, the one that called Eric Cantor into action, 4 of the 5 elements of his innovation agenda were all signed into law. And just to give you a flavor for how these things happened, one of them was wireless, one of them was the Jobs Act for the crowdfunding, and one of them was what I called Startup UI, which is allowing unemployed Americans to make a job as opposed to find a job, which is an unbelievably uplifting theory, but by the way, not law in Virginia, which we got to fix, but is now available for the country. And then the 4th one was these administrative things to simplify the role of government. The one that we didn't get done was modernizing the schools with the capital infusion. But let me just take wireless as an example. It was Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison and Senator Jay Rockefeller, who were the leading figures in the Senate Commerce Committee, who agreed that they wanted to come together in a bipartisan way to figure out what the 10-year roadmap should be on wireless. And they spent, we had a 4-month intensive period where we rolled up our sleeves, they did their work, and I must give a shout out to, of course, Senator Warner, godfather, guru, and mentor, because of his expertise, was very much a party to the debate. They were able to get a majority of Republicans and a majority of Democrats to vote in favor of their wireless legislation about a year ago, June. But that became the kernel of what was rolled up in the Eric Cantor innovation piece that ultimately came to life because of an obscure thing in the payroll tax debate. So good things happen when thoughtful folks write their ideas down, put them together, and negotiate. Is everything in every one of these bills like perfectly liberal or perfectly conservative? No, they're the right blend of all. And we had the same culture in Virginia. In Virginia, while people would fight during the legislature, every session, and Secretary Duffy could speak to this, at the end of the session, there was a joint committee on technology and science chaired by Delegate Joe May, who's an inventor. If you ever watch football games, the yellow line, the invisible yellow line that you could see for the yard marker, he's our delegate. He chairs the JCOTS. He would invite the Secretary of Technology into the discussion with the legislature and say, what's the 9-month agenda where we should dig in and study policies on education and healthcare and broadband? And that process would emerge a set of bills that House Republicans, Democrats, Senate would carry, and they would often pass unanimously. If you look back on the innovation topics that are in the state of the Commonwealth, they almost always passed unanimously if the JCOTS, because it was sort of like this weird signal, dog whistle. If the JCOTS process is working, it's not going to be put into the weird psycho, I hate you, evil stuff. So I think have hope that our republic is working, even though you don't see it on the surface. Now, it's embarrassing because I don't think the American people are aware that these things actually work, and that's maybe where Professor Lennox and the team that set up the Declaration of Innovation might give us a vehicle for that conversation to happen, because it's easy to understand. It does speak to the American people, and maybe that could create more emphasis around what could work. But please take hope that this is happening even in this very fractious environment in Washington.
No, I do know it's happening, and that's precisely my question, because The question is, how do you communicate that to the general public over the 30-minute sign bites? And I guess the follow-on question is there a role for universities, for example? We had the Innovation Summit here in November, it got on C-SPAN and so forth. But if I look around, we have these wonderful sessions, and all the people, I know many of the people in this room, they're the same people. How do we get the message out and make the public understand? That was really my question. Is there a role, a way to do that we can, because you've got a limited audience?
Yeah.
Let me take a swing at that real quickly with a hopeful message to build on the two hopeful messages you just heard. I think we are doing that. I think you're going to hear in a minute from Senator Warner, and Senator Warner is the co-sponsor of the startup bill, which is currently in the Congress. Section 7 of that bill contains some innovative approaches to funding proof of concept research that Tom Skalak and I spent a fair amount of time with the senator's staff helping to draft that portion of the bill based on some of the successes we've generated here in our translational research programs at UVA. In the bill that was passed in December, reauthorizing the SBIR and STTR legislation, again, it was wrapped up in this massively complex, weird defense reauthorization bill. But in about an 1,800-page bill, there's 2 pages in the middle, I promise you, that reflect and actually give a shout-out to UVA's success with the Culture Translational Research Program, and essentially did the following. It's quite minor and yet quite profound. It said, in the course of reauthorizing STTR and SBIR, we're directing the NIH to take $5 million out of its STTR set-aside. So it's not new money, it's already money set aside. And make that $5 million available to 5 universities a year over a 3-year period to do a proof of concept pilot program based on UVA's success. So we are trying to speak to more than our Charlottesville crowd, for sure. And equally, I can tell you some other stories of conversations going on in Richmond, conversations going on, frankly, throughout the world. But it's happening. I wish it could happen more quickly, but we are trying to make sure that the impact of what we're doing is being reflected in a public policy arena as well. We have another question. Thank you, Dick, very much. Another question here.
Or we get the Jersey Shore to talk about innovation. Maybe Snooki will do something to get the population to think about it.
Hi, my name is Ngaza Bell, and actually I took him out of the Bell Labs environment. I worked with Lucent Technologies right up to Agir, and became a director and one of the business units. And innovation and being number one was critical. It was exciting to be number one. Now I work with the Office of Advocacy, working with small businesses, and one of the things that I hear from them is they can't find U.S. workers that have the right technology background. I mean, we look at China. China is graduating PhDs as a matter of national pride and excellence for the future. And one of the things that we've seen in our industry as an engineer is that many engineers actually end up going to the financial sector because they're trying to offset some of the cost of education and the debt that they have. What kind of bold ideas and bold programs is the government willing to do to really help with the cost of education? Because this is becoming a matter of really national excellence for parents to pay for students to go to really good schools and then be able to have them recover that cost and not be burdened by large debts for the rest of their lives. So what are the bold moves that the government is willing to do to help them so that businesses can find good workers? Thank you.
So I'll just answer this very quickly, and I'll do this in 3 parts because this is a very important subject. Number 1, the president defined this as an all-hands-on-deck problem, not a government problem. So under the leadership of Craig Barrett from Intel, over 100 CEOs have joined in a nonprofit called Change the Equation, and their goal is to identify and scale the best programs that inspire kids into the science, technology, engineering, and math fields. Second, and so I think more of that and supporting the work that they're doing is critical. Number 2, we need educational innovation. So, one of the problems I have with the expression STEM is it's really a mixture of 2 completely different regulatory regimes. One is around SM, and the other is around ET. Science and math is heavily understood. It's documented. There's a whole standards of learning and the whole apparatus built around that, big university, curriculum. And then ET is a lot more free. At least in the K-12 environment, there are no technical standards for what it means to be in the ET space. So literally, in Arlington now, we have car mechanics that used to be in VOTech doing more computing because there's more computing power in the car than there was in the space shuttle. So, or one of the earlier versions of the mission to the moon. So the second point is finding more. The president spoke of a vision of a digital tutor that's as effective as the best personal tutor, but as engaging as the best video game. And I think that phrase, that's why he called for an ARPA for education, to put more R&D into how we learn so that we can see more breakthroughs. I think part of the way we get there is what we did. Arnie Duncan and I announced this Open Education Data Initiative. And our basic message was students are entitled to electronic copies of their own assessment data so that a new apps economy will flourish to get those students to share that information, upload their assessment data, and others. For example, in STEM fields, and Scalak will probably tell me what it's like for biomedical engineering, 50% of the kids who enroll thinking they're going into the STEM fields in universities drop out. So if we had apps for retention built on this kind of open education data framework, and we doubled, basically cut in half the loss rate, that would be a phenomenal win for the country. And then I think the third question on higher education costs, we are literally going through a very, very interesting debate right now. Very small, nascent debate, but a debate nonetheless. In the weirdness of Washington, in the Affordable Care Act, when it was put into law, was really two bills. The second of the two bills also included the Higher Ed Act. Just whatever, it's Washington. And in that included $2 billion of federal investment through the community college system to pump up the online education resources industry. I don't know. Oh, what's up, man? I don't know aren't you investing in a bunch of this sort of earnings? So here's an example. Tutor and a bunch of the other companies, isn't that your portfolio? So, badass. So there are these new business models emerging that think of online learning, but we don't know how to price this. So with our friends in the universities, they just charge the same tuition whether you're a 4-year on-campus student or you're a virtual student. But that doesn't really price to marginal cost. So of course they have overhead or whatever. So there's a thing, but there's going to be a marketplace that says, well, maybe there's a market for learning that may be priced lower. It doesn't give you the UVA brand, but it might get you what you need to be an entry-level technology worker for some of the biotech facilities that are coming up, where they don't necessarily need 100, Scalak-trained biomedical engineers, but they need a bunch of what you would traditionally have called VOTech, but they need to be better upskilled. Yeah. So I think you're going to see some radical changes in what is a degree, what is a compilation of online courses. I was teasing Lennox. Lennox is online at Udemy. 6,000 people have taken his business school course, but none of them have any credential to say that they've learned anything yet, because there isn't a mechanism for testing that. I think you'll see those things happen, and if we do those three things well, I think we'll be better. And of course, immigration has to be part of the equation because we've got to close the gap. Well, the So just one last comment on this, and I know it's a very sensitive subject, of course, but I would argue we really have had in the same problem, the analogy to healthcare and education is phenomenal. In healthcare, we pay for volume. A doctor sees 20% more patients, they get paid 20% more, even if they're not healthier at the end. It's the silliest thing you've ever seen. It's a metric of 4-minute office visits is the best doctor in town driving the fancy Mercedes, not the healthiest to the patients that based on the outcome. In a similar question of higher ed, the debate is now starting about outcomes. And this debate started because a sector of the higher education market, some of the for-profit universities in particular, were seen as being a little bit more on the, I can't believe they're getting paid the full rack rate of their tuition with the outcomes that they're producing, which led to the gainful employment regulation, which basically says we're now going to be monitoring outcomes. What are the average incomes of students that graduate? What's that as a share of their debt burden? And if you're underperforming, then you can be essentially disbarred from the student loan program, which was a very controversial regulation, by the way. I don't know, people are obviously still very opinionated about whether it was good or bad. But the point I think that comes out of this is higher ed's now having the debate on measuring outcomes. And I think the gainful employment transparency provisions will start to give us a roadmap for how the broader higher education market looks at what the value is for the dollar spent. This will never be a problem for the UVAs of the world, where the value far exceeds the investment, even at the rates that we're talking about. But there's 7,000 institutions that qualify for student loans, and maybe 50 or 100 that are in that perennially awesome category, or maybe be generous, 500. So you've got 6,500 institutions where there's not a lot of consumer choice and transparency on the outcomes, and I think that movement will start to bring having an effect on price.
The one other thing I would add is look at what the venture community is funding, particularly more on elementary education and self-teaching in high schools, because I think the hope is that we're finding really innovative new models to get more interesting studies out to students, to allow them to teach themselves much more effectively. I think it'll take a while before we really understand how that moves into the university environment. But I think the notion that the venture community has embraced that as being not only good for education, but good for economic returns is a great new movement.
We have just a few minutes. If I could, you were in line as well. Real quick questions, real quick answers. Senator Warner is going to be on the line in 3 minutes.
Thank you for your time this morning. My name is Brady Gens. I'm a part-time grad student here. I also started my own company here in Virginia in October.
Good for you.
But two quick intellectual property questions. One, with the recent change in the patent law to first to file, have you been able to tell much of an impact on the innovation process based on that change? And second, data theft, espionage, whatever. You hear about people stealing the plans for the Joint Strike Fighter, big companies, defense contractors. Is there also kind of a current of stealing from small startups?
Yes.
What's the impact on that on innovation?
So very quick answers. Number one, it's too early to say what the impact of first to file has had on the ecosystem. I would have presumed the reaction, I think Scala can maybe react a little bit further, more folks will be basically filing provisional patents as a way to kind of put the marker down. But it's still early days, and I think they're in the middle of implementing kind of the official regulatory proceedings. So your input at PTO is more than welcome, and they're open to that input. Second, on IP theft, our cybersecurity policy is very much driven by an economic burden, because IP theft is happening not just at the big defense contractors, but in Virginia startups. I got buddies of mine that have had former employees and others hack into their systems. Now that most of our operating environments are in the cloud, usernames and passwords being a little bit less secure than people would have liked, people are starting to export data that perhaps they shouldn't. And frankly, you learn that at the state level, our laws are a little bit kludgy about going after that kind of soft collar threat. There's no hard asset that you report to the cops as being stolen, but it was the entire value of your business. So I think we need stronger awareness of these issues at the state and local level, where a lot of these rules apply. At the federal level, our cybersecurity framework was driven by, in large part, IP theft.
I'll expand real quickly and just say at UVA, I don't think we're seeing a tremendous impact from the first to file. We're already fairly aggressive at getting provisionals filed. I do think it's put additional pressure or established an additional need for the folks in our licensing and ventures group to do more outreach with our research community to be sure they understand the impact. Yes, sir. One quick question.
First of all, thank you for all your comments. They've been very enlightening. I want to try to bridge 2 points that I heard made. Stephan, when you talked about investment infrastructure and how critical that is to be able to enable so much on the right-hand side of the chart for applications, and you've heard a lot of conversation about talent. Is there a certain kind of profile, a DNA, a cultural background, an education that causes people to want to pursue the left side of the chart versus the right? And there are financial rewards, there are cultural rewards. What have you seen, and do you think there's changes that we need to make, and does it come from the university community to get that better in balance?
So it's an interesting topic because it's one we talk about a lot. We talk about specifically together with a lot of our corporate strategic partners. So we've got a number of global corporations that we work very closely with as we look at technologies. And one of the little metrics that I put in front of our group is that if you look at a startup, 50% of the value of that startup is in one individual, the CEO. 25% is in the rest of the team, and only 25% is really in the technology, the business model, everything else. When you look at how companies are valued, it's really hard to sort of agree with that, but if you look at how companies end up, certainly the spread between an Apple, a Microsoft, an Oracle, et cetera, you can point back to saying how much more valuable was Bill Gates. So the tricky part is, how do you actually figure out in the early days who is the next Bill Gates, the next Steve Jobs? And one thing we know is typically they aren't folks who would succeed in a large corporate environment. Typically they're really hard to work with as entrepreneurs because they are the type that will challenge your thinking. And so it is a very unique individual, but it is a cultural aspect that says, I am willing to suspend disbelief, I'm willing to walk through walls, I'm willing to have a long-term view. And I think the more that we can actually understand the importance of those individuals, the more we will find new stars that will lead to those kinds of innovations, not just on the right side of the page, but on the left side.